Hey, what is up? This is David, and welcome to the Flow program. And in today's very short lesson, we are going to be covering the 80-20 principle. And the reason why this lesson comes first before all the other lessons is because I'm going to be referring to the 80-20 principle quite a lot throughout the program. So I really want you to get a grasp on this principle. And whenever I refer to this principle, you will understand what this principle is all about. And even if you know about the 80-20 principle, I hope this lesson can refreshen your memory on this concept. And the 80-20 principle, it's an evergreen principle, meaning that it's not some like trendy tactic or technique or anything like that. And in fact, it actually stems from nature. This concept was brought out because of an observation of nature. So it's an evergreen principle that can't really be outdated. And another word for this, or another terminology for this, is known as the law of the vital few. What is the law of the vital few? Well, it's really taking 80-20 principle to the extremes. And this is a concept from essentialism, where we are really trying to focus on the vital few that makes a great impact rather than the trivial many. So instead of like being distracted by like 100 other things, we are really trying to place our focus and wrap our life around the vital few that really makes a big impact and big difference in our lives, rather than worrying about all these other trivial menial tasks and other things that zap our attention. And instead we're placing that attention on the vital few that really makes the greatest difference. And so again, 80-20, it can't be outdated because it's an evergreen principle. The principle is actually stemmed from nature. And here's a little history lesson. The 80-20 principle was first documented in 1906 by an Italian economist and engineer named Vilfredo Pareto. And the 80-20 principle is actually also known as the Pareto principle. And it's not to be confused with Pareto efficiency, because that is a completely different thing. So we're going to be focusing on the Pareto principle here. So what he noticed back in the day was that he noticed 80% of the land in Italy was owned by roughly 20% of the population of Italy. And in fact, if you take a chart of the world GDP in 1989, the richest 20% of the entire world owned about 82.70% of the entire income. And so Pareto, he thought, that's very interesting. And he also started to notice this trend, the stats in other areas of life, not just in wealth, not just in economics. And 80-20 is also average, by the way. There are many numbers that can be used here. It can be skewed. 90-10, 95-5, these are very common. Even 99-1, which again is focusing on the vital few, right? So the main idea is this: the bulk majority of the amount was made up of a small percentage of the whole. A small percentage of the whole owned or created about 80% or more, sometimes more, of the majority of the amount. So it didn't just happen in economics. The pattern was actually everywhere, right? And especially in nature. Pareto noticed that when he went to his backyard, and he had a garden in his backyard where he was growing peas, he noticed that about 20% of the pea pods would actually produce about 80% of the peas. So he realized that, wow, this wasn't just in economics or statistics. This also happens in nature. So it's everywhere around us. And Richard Koch, he is the author of 80-20 principle, and he actually noticed this pattern in business and management. And you can see the book here. And he realized, wow, this principle actually exist in management and in business, because he noticed that 80% of profits usually come from about 20% of the customers. And so 20% of the most loyal customers made up a bulk of the profits for a business. And you can take this idea to the extreme, and Tim Ferriss, he calls this firing your lower quality customers, right? Because you only need like the 20% of the most loyal customers to really make the bulk of your profits. But the inverse also happens as well. So the inverse of 80-20 goes something like this. So like the negative stuff, like 80% of the complaints came from about 20% of the customers. So the idea in business is if you get rid of the lowest 20% of those lower quality customers, then most of your complaints go away. And this idea comes from Tim Ferriss, right? He's the author of the 4-Hour Workweek, and he really popularized this idea of 80-20. But you can see that 80-20 comes in many different aspects of your life. It is everywhere. For example, 80% of your stress can come from 20% of your friends. And in Microsoft, they noticed that fixing 20% of their most reported bugs resulted in 80% of those related crashes and errors to be solved. And a long time ago, video rental shops, they noticed that 80% of their revenue came from 20% of their videotapes. So how can we use this in productivity? How can we use this for better focus? Well, how we can use this 80-20 principle to be more productive without doing more work is pretty simple. Is focusing on 20% of the work that will produce 80% of the results. Focusing on the vital few versus the trivial many. So we want to double down on 20% that's working and remove the 20% that's not working. So we want to look at it from both ends of the spectrum here. We want to remove 20% of the things that are not working, and we also want to double down on the 20% that is working. This is really the essentials of productivity and being good at producing things. Then you'll get to the extremes of hyper productivity, 99-1, which is the main thing, the one thing. And we're going to be covering the one thing in a future lesson. But this is taking 80-20 to the extremes here, right? The vital few, focusing on just one thing and one thing only, and removing everything else. And when you do that, you'll get hyper focused. So again, it's known as the vital few. And we take things that are working to the extremes, but not all the way that it becomes a risk. So we want to really go to the extremes of like 99-1, for example, and just focus on one thing. So we want to use this principle to our advantage, but we also want to be smart about this and use common sense to see in the areas where it's not working. Okay, and I'm going to refer back to the 80-20 principle several times throughout the course. I'm going to mention it in keto and fasting and MVP and a lot of other lessons. So I just want to bring this information to you, and hopefully you can understand it with this lesson. And the thing is, like I said, we can take things to the extreme, 80-20, 99-1, but it also has its time and place. Again, we want to use our common sense. It can't be used for everything. And you can't and probably shouldn't use it for everything. Like, for example, if you are building a skill, building out your craft, and it's something that you are really, really passionate about, I don't think 80-20 principle would be the best approach to building your craft, right? I mean, you definitely want to look for shortcuts, but in terms of like deep work and really becoming the best in the world at something, then you have to go all out, like 100% at something, right? So 80-20 principle has its time and place, and sometimes it might not work depending on what you are using it for. But when it comes to productivity and getting focused and getting shit done, then 80-20 is your friend. So we are going to be using this a lot throughout the program. And we'll go deeper into this concept and more within those few weeks. And so I will mention this throughout the remainder of the course wherever relevant. So just look out for that. So the action item for today is very, very simple. It's not even an action item, I would say, but just look for the 80-20s in life. Really think to yourself, what is the 20% of this situation that brings the 80% of the results? And look for the inverse 80-20. What is the negative 20% that brings about 80% of the problems? So you really want to become conscious of this. So look out for these principles in everyday life. And remember to focus on the vital few versus the trivial many. Don't become distracted with all of these nonsense and noise and materialism that really doesn't make a big difference in your life. Instead, focus on the vital few that really bring you happiness, that really bring you flow, and that really brings that passion in your life. So that's it for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you inside the program. Talk soon.